Hey guys, good afternoon. I'm going to give us about 2 more minutes here and we'll get started. Welcome in, everybody. Yo, Rack, what I'm trading today, it's going to be ES pretty much just like every other day. I might look at some NQ today, this week as well too, but probably going to keep focusing on ES. Last week was actually a really good week for ES in general, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. But I know A-Train and Goose are probably going to be looking at some gold this week, so it should be pretty exciting. All right, guys, we are going to get started here. So, welcome in. Happy Sunday. Happy pre-market prep. I wanted to take some time to meet with everybody today, really just to talk about the fractals and what it is, what the system is. I want to go over some key terms that a lot of us use when we are trading with fractals, just to make sure that everybody can get kind of comfortable with a lot of the terms and language that the team is using when we are trading within Ascend. I know some of you watch Recon, watch A Train, and watch Goose on TikTok. So I'm hoping that getting some of this intro out of the way will get you guys more comfortable with the system and get you on the right track to learning how to use it. And so the first thing I want to go over is like a very, very basic thing, right? And what actually is the fractal system? So, the fractal system was actually invented all the way back in 2004 by a gentleman named Russell. Russell's one of the smartest traders that I've probably ever met. He's been in the markets probably for longer than most of us have been alive. And so he developed this system to really try to break down the stock market movement into more of a fractal geometry display. So, what does that exactly mean? Unlike a linear chart, like what we see on my Thinkorswim here, where you kind of see price linearly moving by candle, you can kind of just always see a general trend up, right, on most US equities. The fractal system kind of breaks this down into bullish and bearish momentum. And so, more often than not, you won't be seeing a linear chart moving up and down. You'll be seeing a chart that oscillates between bullish and bearish waves. And so, while the fractal system does not predict future movement, it really more so acts as a measuring instrument for seeing historic highs and lows on any stock to help users identify those high probability bounce and reject areas. So I want to kind of show you guys a little bit of a difference between what a linear chart looks like and what a fractals chart looks like. So let's look at ES specifically here. This is ES on a linear daily chart. And as you can see, right, it kind of just goes up, right? There's probably some ways that you can look at support and resistance, but in general, if the price is bearish, it's going to be moving up. And if it's bullish, or sorry, if it's bullish, it's going to be moving up. If it's bearish, it's probably going to be moving down. So if we look at this same time frame on a fractals chart, you'll notice it looks like price actually didn't really go anywhere over the course of the whole year. And so, like I said, the fractal system kind of takes price action and looks at it from an aerial view, and it helps us determine how strong bullish or bearish momentum is in the market at any given point. And so, if the market is bullish, you'll see long waves tend to form, and if the market kind of switches to an overall sentiment of bearish, you'll tend to see short waves form. And so right now we're looking at every single candle on this particular fractal chart is showing a daily candle. And one thing I really want to show you guys is that while we see a lot of this movement kind of in and out of this 20% and 10% odds areas, you see these crazy outliers. So this outlier is really interesting because we had insane bearish momentum all the way down. You guys can see on the blue text box at the bottom of my screen, it says April 7th, 2025. Price was all the way down to basically 40, what does that say there? 49.35, so 4,935. If we go back to our linear chart, back to that April 7th time frame, you'll notice it was back here when we had this huge movement down. And so, yes, while this does show a lot of bearish intention to the downside, you can see that on the fractals chart, because of this really, really strong bearish momentum, we had an incredibly powerful outlier to build us this huge bearish candle, essentially. Eventually, obviously, price oscillated back to a neutral point and ended up making a bullish wave. But you can kind of see that even though on a linear chart, price just continues to inch up and up and up, our fractals chart tends to show us overall sentiment in the market on bullish movement and bearish movement. So, oh no, my camera's blocking it. Sorry. I'll try to move my thing a little bit further. Um, okay. So that's a pretty like basic picture of what a fractals chart does tend to look like. So while we kind of see it oscillate back and forth, we will never really see a fractals chart constantly moving up like linear charts do. So the next thing I do want to talk about to kind of solidify how these fractals charts actually work is just a few key terms we talk about a lot in Ascend to make sure you guys can get comfortable with some of that as well. And so some of those words I want to look at are pivot, waves, vector, low percent probability of continuation, and then the term days to load. So let's first talk about pivot. Pivot is kind of what we would consider as a living axis that shows us any change in trend. If we're trading above pivot on a fractals chart, we're in a bullish trend. And if, of course, we're trading below pivot, we are in a bearish trend. Pivot on every single fractals chart is going to be this black line that kind of splits the chart right down the middle. It'll always show us our most recent pivot price on the far right-hand side of the screen. So like 68.55.50 is the current pivot price. And now, while some might consider that pivot would be like a supportive or a resistive zone, that's actually not exactly the case. It kind of just shows where that bullish or bearish sentiment is going to flip if we do get there one way or the other. And so as we go through obviously various time frames, you'll see pivot is a little bit different on every single chart. So on the 10 wave 15 minute, we'll see right now it's at 6,861. If we look at the 50 wave 1 minute, pivot's at 6,888. And so of course, depending on the time frame and depending on how much history you're looking at in the fractal system, our pivot will change. And so a lot of times, whenever we are trading, um, myself, A Train, Goose, Recon, we might be saying, hey guys, we're trading above pivot and we're trading above vector. So we may be looking at high probability areas for reject, indicating that we're in a bullish trend. And we would eventually be looking at areas to reject to move us back down. Um, can you use for a trend direction? Yes. So, Ryan, you can use fractals for a trend direction entry. I don't think I would recommend using pivot for a trend direction entry. I think the better tool you're going to want to be using for that is probably going to be vector. And we are going to talk about that next. And so, pivot and vector, while they're pretty similar, they do act a little bit differently. And we'll kind of talk through those few differences. So again, guys, just to solidify, right? If it's this black line that does split the two, the charts in half into basically, are we in a bearish wave or a bullish wave? But pivot does not tend to act as support or resistance. And so if we tend to be trading around pivot, you'll notice that myself or A Train, we're not really saying, hey guys, we're at pivot, we're looking for a bounce or a reject, just because it's kind of that neutral zone where the area flips. Now moving into a more, I would say, heavy data point that you could actually trade off of is going to be vector. And so vector is this purple line on our chart. Let me zoom in on this wave one just so we can see a little bit bigger, a little bit easier for us to look at. So vector is this purple line on our chart. And vector is a very, very dynamic, a very, very dynamic, what I would almost consider, I hate to call it an indicator because it's not lagging data. It's constantly finding our equilibrium of buying and selling balanced within each cycle. And so this is an area that I would almost consider as like a decision point whenever we are trading. And so if we're tending to trade above vector, anytime we would come and move back down into touching vector, we would see that as a supportive area. So for example, if we're in an uptrend day and price is tending to trade above vector. If we have any sort of pullbacks back into vector, that would be a really great place to look for a bounce. Furthermore, if we're trading below vector in a bearish cycle below pivot and we start to retrace back up, we might use vector as a rejection area for continuation down. And so again, vector is going to be different on every single time frame. So let's go actually into a smaller time frame so you can see how dynamic this purple line actually is. So here we go on our 50 wave 1 minute. This is one of our smallest time frames we actually do look at. And while I don't independently trade off of any particular wave or days to load chart, I look at several. This is one of the smallest ones I do look at and is actually pretty impactful when you are looking for scalping. And so you can see here at this particular time point, this was back on October 31st at 4 o'clock. So this is basically the end of the day. You can see that Vector was trading at 68.84, trading down to 68.82, 81, 80, 79, 77. It basically seemed like we had a pretty bearish move on the end at the end of the day, especially because we were in this really nice bullish cycle where Vector was trading at 68.87 and we had this really strong revision down basically at market close to put us into a bearish cycle. And so one of the things that I would look at, and like this is actually a pretty good example back here earlier in the day in on October 31st, we saw this really strong trend down on our purple vector. And you can notice that on these candles, price was trading below vector. We had some moments where we tried to retrace up, tested vector, tried to break over it, never really held, and just had this really strong continuation down. And so vector is a really, really great tool to use to understand where you could find trend entries, or inversely places to trim if you're like looking at a bounce area, for example, or rejection back up into vector. So Bao has a really good point here. Technically, it could be entry at pullback or directional. So he says he uses the wave 1 5 minute or the wave 3 5 minute is what he notices. He doesn't recommend it though. So I do agree with Bao, like the 50 wave 1 minute, the wave 1 5 minute, or the wave 3 5 minute. Those are very, very small time frames that actually don't look at a huge amount of history. So like I personally would never be trading rejections off of just the 50 wave 1 minute. If you're like a scalper who's maybe looking at like 1 to 1 risk, um, and just trying to like scrap for a couple points here and there could be some opportunity here. But like for my personal trading strategy, we try to look for at least like 3 to 1 risk, and try to get like between 15 and 20 points out of ES. So like I wouldn't really want to be like looking at just one small time frame. But in general, again, we talk about vector a lot in Ascend. We talk about vector clusters a lot in Ascend. And vector clusters is kind of exactly what it sounds like. We tend to try to find areas where vector is trading across various time frames. So for example, on the 50 wave 1 minute, we're seeing vector currently at 68.70. If we go to the 10 wave 15 minute, we'll see vector at 68.82. So that's actually a pretty big range, 68.70 to 68.82. And then maybe here we'll see 68.72. And so we'll try to look across various timeframes to see like, is there a high density area, maybe within like 5 or 7 points, where multiple timeframes are trading around the same vector area? Those are really, really high probability bounce or rejects area for us because it's saying not only is our really, really small scalping time frame showing opportunity for support or resistance at vector, but our larger time frames are showing opportunity in that same area. So more often than not, we will be looking at vector cluster and trying to see if there's like 3 or 4 time frames that have vector in kind of that same area for like a vector cluster bounce or reject. So again, guys, vectors that purple line on our chart that just constantly finds that equilibrium of buying and selling balanced within each cycle. So if we're below vector in a bearish wave, we've got a pretty decent bearish trend. If we're above vector in a bullish wave, we have a pretty decent bullish trend. So MJ, yeah, I am going to, I can explain wave again. And I think actually wave is the next thing on my list. And so a wave is either going to be displayed as bullish or bearish in the fractal system. So let me go back to our wave one daily, just because this is like a really clean, easy chart to look at, and we can kind of zoom in and see a couple examples here. Let me zoom into this a little bit better too. Okay, so let's talk about waves next. So we've talked about pivot, right? Pivot is that point that changes bullish waves or bearish waves. If we cross pivot, we go from a bullish wave or bearish wave and vice versa. We don't really see pivot as like a supportive or resistive area. We talked about vector, which is this purple line that is kind of showing that constant equilibrium of buying and selling pressure within each wave. And we can use that to kind of act as supportive or resistive areas when looking at trends, potential trim points, or even rejection points on a chart. So the next thing we do want to talk about is our waves. We talk about waves a lot. So like I said, these waves can either be displayed as bullish waves or, waves moving above pivot, or a bearish wave, which is price moving below pivot and going further down. Um, Depending on how long each wave cycle is, this essentially measures the magnitude of strength behind each bullish or bearish movement. And so, if you guys were with us last week, one of the things that we talked about a lot in our morning market prep was how strong of a bullish wave cycle we were in on the wave one daily. And when I say how strong of a bullish cycle we were in, it was because day after day, we were making new higher highs on our fractals chart. And every single time you make a new higher high throughout each time period, your odds of continuing higher with that bullish momentum becomes lower and lower. So essentially, if you have a wave that builds, on the wave one daily, for example, you can see four highs in this area. More often than not, you have a very, very low probability of continuation further. And this shows on those charts, right? You can see we came all the way up past our 20% odds and almost made it all the way to 10% odds of continuation, which we'll talk about percentage continuation. But our waves measure the magnitude of our bullish or bearish movements. So looking at waves, there's a second thing that I really want you guys to note here is at the end of each wave cycle, we tend to make these things called open states, or we always make these things called open states. So at the very end of this massive bullish wave cycle we had last week, at the end of it, we created this open state at that wave cycle's high, which was at 7,066.92. This is basically the fractal system saying, hey guys, we had some crazy movement on this bullish wave cycle because of all of that momentum. If we ever have that much momentum again in the future, there's a pretty decent chance that its price is going to struggle to get past that particular high. And now, the one thing I want to say is because we don't see this chart moving like, linearly up like we do see a linear chart go, these open states will always change price depending on where price is actually moving. And so, maybe in 2 weeks, this open state won't be 7,066, it may be 7,050 or 7,100. But basically, every single time a wave cycle ends, we create these open states where the fractal system says, hey guys, we finished a wave cycle. The magnitude of that wave cycle was either really big or really small. We might struggle to make a wave cycle larger than that the next time we do get into that type of movement. And so, one of the things that we could technically look at on this wave one is now that we're in another bullish wave cycle because we're trading above pivot, we could look to that 7,066 price point and say, if we ever did get up there as we move into this next bullish wave cycle, 7,066 would be a pretty decent point for us to want to reject because this was such a magnificent move to the top side. It'd probably be pretty hard to beat such a large magnitude push of buying again. So um, and Bao, I just want to point out what Bao's saying here. So Bao's another one of our admins and Ascend guys, and he's really, really good at swing trading. And he tends to hold a lot of longer positions using fractals as well. So he's talking about the numbers of waves you have to select. Bigger wave numbers shows bigger cycles in the market. So like a wave 200 is going to show market trend for a year, for years, for example. You could also look at like 1,500, you can look at 10,000 days to load and it looks ridiculous, right? But this is 10,000 waves of history, or sorry, 10,000 days of history. So you could really see a massive picture in the market to say like, what are the odds of moving past these certain points and how has price acted in the last 10,000 days? And so, to Bao's point, a lot of us do tend to look at like 200 days. Sometimes we'll look at like 1,000 days if we're trying to do like swing leaps or something like that. But for day trading, we tend to keep it within like 200 days on the wave one and even less, like sometimes even 50 days on like a 20-minute chart, for example. So so we have a question in here. There's a couple questions about open states. So can we refer to open states as target for price to reach in a bullish or bearish trend? I think that's a really, really good idea. If you're able to catch some sort of like bounce into a bullish trend on a bullish wave cycle, open states are fantastic trim points. Another strategy that we do use in Ascend, which we call the gray box strategy, is actually looking at a high density of open states for potential like bounce or rejection points, for example. So like, and guys, this is literally just representative. This is no analysis at all. So please don't take any trades off of this, right? But like, for example, on this 50 wave 1 minute, right? There's a 20% odds. Oh my goodness, I zoomed in too much. There's a 20% odds in an open state at this like 68, 67. Say we go through a bunch of different time frames and we see that there's many open states at 68, 67. We would consider that like a gray box setup to say, guys, this would be a high probability bounce area based on a high density of open states. But like MJ, to your point, if you were able to catch like a short to be chasing this bearish trend, open states would be fantastic trim points as well. So similar to vector, right? You can use vector as a reject, or if you're coming back up into vector, you can use it as a trim point. There's another question in here. Would it make sense if we reject off of an open state to, hang on here. Would it make sense if we reject off of an open state or vector to target profit at the next open state? Yep. That's a really, really good, a really, really good strategy as well. Like I said, like let's just say, we had a high probability setup to bounce off of 68, 67. Maybe you would enter the trade at 68, 67, and then as you started moving back up towards vector, you could take a trim point at like 68, 70 and a half. So, that's not that many points, but you would say, all right, we're seeing this open state as support. We'll tap it, bounce off of it, take that first trim at vector. And then if we can continue to see strength and break above vector, you would probably want to look at like percentage odds and revisions above pivot for more trim points as well. So I really do like vector too, right? Because it does give you a dynamic place to understand where you would maybe want to put stop losses as well. Um, so yeah, you guys are totally right on cue, right? Like open states as targets for price, or potentially open states as bounce or reject areas with vector as trim point. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is our low percent probability of continuation. And that is simply these bars here that say like 20% odds, 50% odds, 80% odds. This is a pretty simple, like, what do you want to call it? Uh, I guess like lesson within fractals, but this is basically just showing us like when price has gotten to these certain places, there has been a 10% odds of continuation below these particular areas. When price has gotten to this particular point, there's a 2% odds that price has continued. And so again, like in Ascend, a lot of times we'll say, hey guys, we have a high probability bounce area, say, because we're looking at, some bounce area to the downside. And we could say, we have open states across 3 time frames, and our 50 wave 1 minute has a 2% odds of continuation at this particular level. And so we kind of like that as a pretty like high probability area to say, guys, like in this particular time frame that we're looking at, price has only gone past this magnitude of movement 2% of the time. So it's kind of saying we have a 98% chance of success for it to either get pinned to that area or, of course, bounce and stay back within the range that we're looking at. And so that one's pretty simple, the percentage of continuation. But when we say that, it's simply these areas on our chart that we have marked to the downside and upside. When we say, like, oh, we're at a 10% odds level, that simply just means there's 10% odds of continuation further. So we kind of have that 90% chance of coming back down, essentially. Cool. That one's pretty easy. I like that one. And then finally, and we kind of talked about this, and Bao has been talking about it in chat as well. The last one I really do want to talk about is our days to load. So I do want to go back to our wave one daily. This particular one that I'm looking at is 200 days. So it's like, more or less like calendar year to date, you can almost argue. But whenever we say like days to load, we can change our days to load. Um, to basically anything you want. Like you can go really, really low time frame to say, I only want to see 10 days to load and look at how silly that looks because it's literally only showing 10 days. Or you can go super crazy and go all the way up to 15,000 days to load, which I don't even know how many years that is, but it's like several years of data. And so whenever we look at days to load and different days to load, if we're in some kind of like crazy bullish movement or crazy bearish movement where we just keep making more and more like H4s, H5s, H6s, or like lower lows day after day after day, more often than not, we'll try to zoom out to larger days to load to understand if historically there's been any other trends like this in the past that's maybe even like beyond the singular year that we're looking at, just to give us a little bit more insight into like this is a really big trend. Have we seen a trend this big historically? And what are some of the expectations that we have seen from that trend historically? So it's kind of crazy to think about like the 15,000 days to load. Like you could literally go back and look at what price action and what momentum was doing back during COVID. Like that was 5 years ago at this point, and we know that equities moved really crazy back then. You can go back that far and kind of understand what that bullish and bearish movement looked like back at that time. And so we don't really change our days to load too much when we look at stuff day to day, especially for day trading. But if we are looking at things like swing leaps or potentially like equity buy-ins, if we have like a really strong move to the downside, sometimes we will load larger days to load just to inform like, just smarter entry points on like equity buy-ins or things like that. So that's really kind of like the last, I guess, concept I wanted to talk about. And guys, like one of the things I do want to say about this Intro to Fractals workshop, by design, we wanted to keep it very simple. We wanted to get you guys comfortable with some of the key terms we use, right? What is pivot? It's that neutral point on the chart that changes us from bullish to bearish waves and vice versa. What is vector? It's the purple line on our chart that's showing that constant equilibrium of buying and selling balanced within each cycle and gives us really good opportunities for bounce, rejects, or trim points whenever we're in a trade. You look at low percentage of probability of continuation as well as open states. Those can be really high probability bounce or rejection areas depending on what direction the trend is moving in. And then finally, looking at days to load, you can look at shorter days to load to look at a little bit more recency, or longer days to load to look at like very, very large variations in trend, almost over the course of 10 years in some situations. And so I think what we really want to do in Ascend is constantly have these really simple workshops, no greater than 30 minutes, just to give you guys tidbits of getting comfortable with the fractal system, making sure that you know what like me, Bao, Goose, A Train, and Recon are talking about when we're actually executing trades in the fractal system, and then ideally making you guys very self-sufficient fractals users as well to become that next generation of professional traders that can really turn this into a career of their own. And so guys, with that, I do want to keep this one pretty short, sweet, and to the point. But I know that Goose and Bao have been in chat answering a lot of questions for you guys. I want to make sure that you guys can continue asking them. So please, pop notes in general chat in Ascend or in trading chat in our premium group, and we will be very, very happy to talk through this with you guys. But I hope this was helpful, and we will have another workshop going through a couple of the more advanced things in fractals. Like for example, we have data warehouse, we have spread monster, we have algo fun. So we will be looking at a lot of the other capabilities because this is a massive system. So I really want to make sure the folks that are using it are getting the most they can out of it and becoming good spread traders, equity traders, and day traders. So all right, guys, with that, that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for joining. And thank you very much, Goose and Bao, for moderating chat. I do appreciate that. But guys, if there's any other further questions, we'll be talking to you guys in Ascend. I will be on Top Step TV tomorrow morning doing my morning market prep with the Top Step team. But as always, we will be live trading at New York Open with our Ascend Premium. And I believe that A Train will also be going live on TikTok later tonight, trading some gold. So constantly want to be teaching you guys and getting you guys more proficient at this stuff, but appreciate you. And we'll see you at Market Open tomorrow. See you guys.